Thought it would be nice to start off this talk with another talk. This is Muriel Cooper at age 68. The year is 1994. She's on stage at the 5th annual Technology, Entertainment, and Design Conference held in Monterey, California. This is a TED Talk. It doesn't quite look like a TED Talk, as you notice she doesn't have on shoes to start with. She's made herself comfortable in the chair. At this talk, she was presenting the work of her students in the Visible Language Workshop on immersive, interactive computer interface environments. The talk was exceedingly successful, so much so that apparently Bill Gates asked for a copy of the materials afterwards. It made a big impact in the world of graphic design where I was at the time. I was working out at IDEO in San Francisco, and as an interaction designer when that was a pretty new discipline. I worked for one of our students, and this work was absolutely everywhere. In the intervening years, I was shocked to see it kind of recede from view. I think I'll play a little bit of this video first.
I have a couple of, can you hear me? Yes. I have a couple of personal things in characteristic of the TED philosophy. First of all, I'm testing the boundaries to see how truly comfortable one can make oneself here.
This is another portrait of Muriel Cooper. This is from 1972. This is, well, it's included in the book, and it is captioned in the book as Muriel Cooper, 1972, at MIT, surrounded by unidentified males. You see, again, she happens to not have on shoes, but it should be clear that this work was done in an overwhelmingly male context at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where, of course, she had a difficult time navigating among the hurdles that were thrown down in front of her, but she did it with great skill and aplomb, according to those who were around her. So I think this is a nice image, the combination of her sweater and the situation, the dynamics going on in this image. Okay, this is a third portrait. This is a self-portrait of Muriel Cooper. She's the one on the right in the image. This was made in 1967. This was made in the context of a computer-aided design and programming class that Muriel Cooper had audited at MIT in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. This class was taught by Nicholas Negroponte, who went on to found the Media Lab at MIT. This image is made by a computer program, as you might guess. And in fact, it's using an alphanumeric printer kind of against itself to turn it into an image-making machine. And we're well familiar with ASCII art at this point. In 1967, considerably less so. But there are a number of qualities about this image which I think are typical of why her work is important. One of which is she had a tendency to kind of use the existing and future-looking tools against themselves to find out where the edges are and where it breaks, what works, what are the possibilities that haven't been outlined yet. The second thing is she's pictured here together with her good friend Donase Dondas, who is also a graphic design educator in Boston and a friend she studied together with at Mass College of Art. In many of the images that I'm going to show you, either Muriel Cooper won't be in them, or else she'll be surrounded by other people. And I think this is perhaps one reason why her work has relatively disappeared since 1994. It doesn't file itself neatly under the kind of name of a single great author. In fact, it's largely collaborative. The purple book is called Muriel Cooper, but so much of the work inside is not directly her work. Rather, it's the work of her students, it's work that she facilitated by setting up situations, and it's work which jumped over disciplinary boundaries, so it's kind of hard to file. Muriel Cooper worked at MIT for 40 years. She worked in, well, it's easy enough to break down her work into three categories. She first worked in design at MIT at the Office of Publications, and then as the first design director of the MIT Press. It was actually design and media director. She taught in the School of Architecture beginning in 1974, instigating a class called Messages and Means and carrying on establishing the Visible Language Workshop, which is a printing and teaching and design workshop. Thirdly, in 1985, she was a founding faculty member of the MIT Media Lab. Originated by Nicholas Negroponte, she was one of several of the faculty who organized this facility, and at that point she was working on computer interfaces. Now, I think if you probably asked her to think about those three words, I think it would look something much more like this. Kind of all one activity. They were never discrete. And in fact, when she was working on books at the MIT Press, she was thinking about how they might appear on screen. Or when she was making a film of a book that I'll show later, she was thinking about how she might show that to students. And so there's this kind of overlapping and recursive feedback loop between these activities. However, for ease of communicating the story, we're going to leave it in its three parts. So I'll start in design. In 1962, the Technology Press, which was MIT's in-house publishing, was switching their name to the MIT Press. And the director of the press consulted with Paul Rand, a well-known American graphic designer at the time, and asked if he might consider doing their logo. He said maybe he can't do it, but he could recommend some people. He recommended Muriel Cooper to do it. Okay, this is not the logo for the MIT Press that Muriel Cooper designed. This one is also not the logo for MIT Press that Muriel Cooper designed. Also not the logo for MIT Press. These were all proposals that Muriel Cooper made. She was working as a freelance designer on this assignment. Another, I think this could have been a great logo for MIT Press, but it was not the one that she designed. Finally, this one's getting a bit closer to what eventually became one of her best-known works. And in fact, when I started digging through what existed of the Muriel Cooper archive at Massachusetts College of Art, which is a bunch of bankers' boxes with mixed materials in there, inside of one, I found among Reebok high tops and VHS tapes and sheets of slides, I found a kind of crumpled up piece of sketch paper. And on that paper, I recognized down at the bottom what would become the MIT Press logo that's existed for 50 years by this point, which would indicate something about its success. You see the lines here are the set of books drawn axonometrically on a shelf with the fifth one pulled up and the sixth one pulled down. Here's the final version of that. If you kind of squint your eyes or raise your bar for abstraction, you'll see MITP, which I'm sure we all see. I think this is one of my favorite pieces of graphic design, period, for a number of reasons, one of which is I suppose, the fact that it has existed for 50 years is a qualifier, but I like the fact that it's a static graphic, but it looks like it's machine readable. It looks like this is meant to be a barcode, and something about that kind of equation in 1964, by this point, that equation of books and publishing with electronic information and machine readability, I think that's super strong insight and typical of why I think her work's important. Okay. By 1967, she became the first design and media director of the MIT Press. At the MIT Press, she was overseeing an ambitious publishing program that involved books like this book, which is a collection of the papers delivered at a technical conference, or this book, which is by Seymour Papert and Marvin Minsky, also co-founders of the Media Lab, a book about computational geometry, or this book, which is written by Nicholas Negroponte, called The Architecture Machine, which was around early attempts to apply computers and software to architectural design. It was an ambitious and important publishing program that she was dealing with. This is another book that she designed while at MIT Press. This is called Bauhaus, Weimar, Dessau, Berlin, Chicago. It was published in 1969. It's a big book. As Meg mentioned, it's the same size as the purple thing on the table over there. It's about 14 inches tall. Hardback book. It was originally published in German and translated into English. This book was of special importance to Muriel Cooper. The Bauhaus, the important design school in Germany and transferring to the United States, that mixed hands-on production and teaching and design in kind of overlapping ways, was she considered that her principal point of departure for her teaching and her designing and her work. She spent 2 years designing this book. The book included syllabi and correspondence and documentation of this essential design school that originated around the Industrial Revolution. And this is the first edition was popular. Second edition, slightly smaller, paperback. Here she used the offset printing process, which uses cyan, magenta, and yellow in overlapping, overprinting forms to produce all the full color images. Here she just shifts the printing plates, and what you're left with is a distinctive graphic that's an index of the process or register of the process that made it. And I think this is typical in our work as well, and something else that certainly drew me to it. It's as focused on the process as it is on the product, but not as an end, not in order to get a strange or different product, but more as a kind of equivalency between these things. The Bauhaus was no abstraction to Muriel Cooper at this time in Cambridge. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who was at the Bauhaus, had come to Chicago to set up the new Bauhaus, which became Illinois Institute of Technology Institute of Design. He brought with him Georgi Kepish, who went on to head the school in Chicago and then came to MIT. And Kepish brought Muriel Cooper in to work originally at the Office of Publications. So there's a direct lineage there. As well, Walter Gropius, who was running the Bauhaus previously, was down Massachusetts Avenue running the Graduate School of Design at Harvard. So there was a direct connection. It was not looking from a distance. When this book was done, 2 years lavished of time on it, the MIT Press did something that was kind of surprising. They launched a publicity campaign to announce and promote this important book. And for that, for example, they designed a letterhead. I mean, Muriel Cooper designed a letterhead. They also designed posters. This is like a 36-inch poster, giant blow-up of that self-portrait of Moholy-Nagy, but where the halftone screen is exaggerated to call attention to the kind of mode of production that this is using. And it's strange to imagine that you might design and publish a poster to sell books. I'm not sure how many books it sold, but this is the kind of play that was going on, I think, often within Cooper's work. It's the second poster she designed, same size. This includes every spread in the book. But this was done analog, so each one of those is a piece of film and reduced to fit on this large format. Here we see a kind of detail. And I expect what she was hoping to get to from this was to imagine what it would be like to kind of simultaneously understand this book, to see the images at a kind of more exaggerated speed than what we're used to at this moment. It's a way to kind of interrogate, to prod the media. When she finished the book, she did something else. She made a film of the book where she spent 3 frames for every spread in the book, made a 16mm film, which I'm going to let play right here. This is a recreation of the film that was made for the exhibition that Meg mentioned at Columbia, organized by Robert Wiesenberger and myself. What you see here is the material of the book flowing through the page grid or kind of template that determines its design. And she was already talking about the fact that once digital information was more prevalent, it would come too fast. And we'd need templates and ways to automate the presentation of that material. And this is a different idea than what existed working in a press and on books. She also made this film in order to show her students, to get them to think about the way that a grid plays out over time. Okay, finally, in 1979, MIT Press organized an exhibition called Books 2000, looking forward to what books would be in the year 2000. And she was asked to put the Bauhaus book in there, and this is what she offered, which was the raw manuscript of the book. And that stood in place for the book, which I love it. Kind of amazing. So just a stack of papers, the original typewritten manuscript. Some of the other books that were passing through the press at the time include A Primer of Visual Literacy by Donis A. Dondas, who we saw in the self-portrait ASCII art. This is a graphic design textbook in its 33rd printing. Another book is File Under Architecture, which she did with Herbert Muchamp, who became the architecture critic of the New York Times. This book was produced with a IBM Selectric typewriter to do the typesetting for it. She published this book, Compendium for Literates by Swiss designer and artist Karl Gerstner. It was around text and typography as a kind of graphic event, translated into English. Now, at the MIT Press, there were too many books as well to give much attention to every book. And so a large part of what she did was think through the publishing and design system that existed there. And she developed pages and pages, as far as we could, Robert and I could discern, pages and pages of schemes for how books would pass through the press. So here's a pretty legible one that begins with from easy to complicated, from camera ready to difficult, and they would engage different amounts of kind of design and layout and editing production resources within the press. And the result of that was that a rather high level of design across all the books, even books that were proceedings from academic conferences like this one, 36 Lectures in Biology, would still have a strong high level of design on them. And this is what made the program so strong. Here's a computer software manual. Here's another software manual where typewriter type is simply blown up to make the cover. And finally, here's a last book I'm going to show. It's not unimportant, the subject matter of the books that were coming through the press, because she was engaging with this material and reading it. And this helped arrange her move into her next kind of phase within MIT. In 1974, Muriel Cooper was introduced to Ron McNeil. Ron was a photographic assistant at MIT. Ron had a 4-color offset press, which is a large printing press, about half the size of the stage, I would guess. And they immediately made a connection and thought it would be amazing to teach a class around this press, where students were not only learning about design, but actually making the printed work and learning about how to run a printer and et cetera. They began teaching a class in the Department of Architecture at MIT called Messages and Means. This was the original poster which announced that class. This poster was made using a method that she gave as an assignment often, which was to use the same printing plate and overprint by rotating the sheet of paper each time it goes through the press. So you get kind of overlapping, rotated images on top of each other. The press was also, that offset press was also used to print posters for events that were happening at MIT. For example, this, which is the mechanical artwork, the film, actually, for this poster, which was announcing a traveling art exhibition originating at MIT. Here are a group of students gathered around the press in Messages and Means. I found this image some way into the kind of meandering research process, and I was really happy to see that asterisk poster up behind in the top left of this image, which was a nice loop back to finding the real thing originally. The students were involved hands-on printing. I mean, you can imagine this might be maybe a liability nightmare in today's university, but it was not at the time. There is both a hands-on, there's a do-it-yourself ethic that was also manifested in the assignments and the way that the students worked. They apparently kept all hours in this space. And as well, what they're doing in there, they're doing it self-consciously. So here, this is Ron McNeil in the center of this image, and he's working with the offset press. and cleaning it up or adjusting something. And while he's doing that, he's being recorded, video recorded on a Sony Portapack video camera, which would be brand new at this point. It recorded in black and white. It was handheld, completely radical image-making technology. And then all of this was being recorded by somebody with a camera, a 35mm camera from the other side. So there's absolute, although they were hands-on making this, they were also aware that what they were doing was interesting or worth thinking about anyway, worth representing. The Messages Means class was overwhelmingly popular, and the next year, McNeil and Cooper founded an autonomous center within the School of Architecture called the Visible Language Workshop. It was centered around the printing press. They offered a couple of additional classes. This became more what Muriel Cooper was spending the bulk of her days doing. This is a dummy for the letterhead for the Visible Language Workshop. What you see here is, here's a printed version of it. What you see is a kind of ham-fisted brush stroke, but then which is filled in with a split fountain printing process that gradiates from red to blue, and it's something that you can only do on the press. That's why this mock-up only shows it kind of working like this. And again, I think it's typical of thinking design through its kind of production needs. Here, another version of that letterhead. That letterhead is reproduced well on a Xerox machine. And in fact, they offered a class in Visible Language Workshop called Electrostatics, which is about Xerox machines, because this was a new image-making technology. It had the quality of making immediate prints. You could work on it, change your mind, make another thing, change your mind, work on it. And this kind of quick feedback loop was something she was always desiring of the kind of graphic tools she was working with. In 1980, Muriel Cooper and Ron McNeil were asked to submit an article for Department of Architecture in-house journal called Plan. And that was supposed to be about like what's going on in the Visible Language Workshop. And instead of responding with a set of images or student works or something like this, Cooper decided to respond a different way. So this is actually the first page of the article. And this was a letter back to the editor. And the letter said, I'm going to read a couple excerpts from it. She says, we're not going to give you an article with a collection of images of student work. Instead, the article will fulfill the following criteria. Number one, it would make use of the tools, processes, and technologies of graphic arts media as directly as possible, and tools would be integrated with concept and product. Number two, the author would be the maker, contrary to the specialization mode, which makes the author of the content the author of the form the designer, and the author of the craft the typographer or printer. Number three, visual and verbal representation of the idea would be synthesized rather than separate. And number four, this is the important one, I think, time would remain as fluid and immediate as possible, leaving room for feedback and change. She signs off the letter in a kind of beautiful turn of phrase. She says, this stands as a sketch for the future, and signs it. Here is a spread from inside that article. There's several spreads. They were black and white, high contrast images, just as described in that text. They were made in the workshop. Now, on doing the research, I was really excited to come across this page, which is actually a mocked up, a revised version of the letter that she eventually printed as the first page of that article. That letter was supposed to look off the cuff, right? But of course she worked it. And so here are her own corrections and notes on that. And if you even get up to the top left, you see it says a sketch, if you will, for the future. And I think this document, its kind of markups and changes and feedback and different overlaps of printing and production technologies within it are a kind of good way to read a lot of the intent in her other work. Okay. Now, the Visible Language Workshop was not just printing presses at the time, even from 1974. There's a darkroom and photographic equipment like a large format Xerox camera. There was as well a proto-Photoshop that Ron McNeil had developed with engineering students. It was called SIS, and it allowed direct pixel-by-pixel manipulation of digital images. This was something completely radical at the time. Here's Ron sitting in front of SIS. SIS as well had what they called a scanner, which is really a digital camera to get images into the system. And it also included a large format inkjet printer, which he called the billboard plotter, which you see beyond him. I think this image gives some idea of the kind of what it was like in the workshop. The workshop was a series of 3 rooms, a mix of analog and digital technologies, and kind of no boundaries between these things. Lots of activity, as far as I could understand. But it was all towards an end of making responsive, iterative graphic tools for image making. So here's a diagram, perhaps notional, of the electronic equipment that was in the visible language workshop and the way it went together. It included, for example, a $500,000 Perkin-Elmer computer, 300 megabyte disk drive, and so on and so forth. Now, Cooper made this image using a collection of that image-making material. Now, this image was the 2 images that are of Muriel Cooper here. Started out as video images made in 1974, captured on a Sony Portapac. Those images were digitized into SIS, into that electronic image manipulation software. They were then, 10 years later, transmitted down the hall at MIT from one room to another over something called a slow scan transmission, which is basically a color fax, same way they sent images from the moon. And then finally, those images were displayed on a pair of stacked monitors. And then that whole contraption was photographed with a 30 by 40 inch, very large Polaroid camera to give you this image where you see like the chemical peel of the instant Polaroid. You see the scan lines from the CRT monitors. You see Muriel Cooper wearing a Polaroid camera, an SX70, which would have been brand new in 1974, around her neck. And in fact, it's even replacing one of her eyes. And the thing I like the most about it is the fact that in one image, she's making a photograph of the person taking the video of her. In the next image, that image is out of her camera, getting ready to develop. And if we could just out of frame, we'd see the person who was actually recording her, which I never figured out who it was. We never figured out who it was. In 1985, Muriel Cooper was asked by Nikos Negroponte, who was in the Department of Architecture, and he was founding the Media Lab at MIT. Muriel Cooper was invited as one of the founding faculty to establish a research unit within it. Now, what I understand from the invitation was that she was asked to consider giving her group a new name, not the Visible Language Workshop. She steadfastly refused. She said, you know, even though we're going to be working on computer interfaces, like, it's the same concerns that I've been thinking about both at MIT Press and with the teaching. It's all the same thing. So she insisted on continuing the Visible Language Workshop name. Now, the MIT Media Lab was, as Negroponte described it, if the Bauhaus was a design school for the industrial age, then the Media Lab was to be a design school for the information age. Here we see, here's an inside of one of the rooms. It was in a new building designed by I.M. Pei on the campus of MIT. It consisted of stacked floors of drop ceiling spaces with lots of CRT monitors here and there, carpet, et cetera. Here's Muriel Cooper and Ron McNeil in the space of the Visible Language Workshop at the Media Lab. When they moved into the space, they originally insisted that there would be heavy power in order to bring in the printing presses, but they got so interested in the screens that they never brought in any of the analog printing material. Some of the work they were doing there included reports such as this proposal called Books Without Pages, which imagines what it would mean to have a type on the screen, essentially. It includes ideas about page flipping interfaces, dynamic text, which communicates by the way that it changes over time. They were working with a space at the Media Lab called the Media Room, which was an immersive media environment, all centered around a Eames Lounger chair, and which included a projected wall size interface, a smaller touchscreen interface, trackpads built into the arms of the chair, and the interfaces as well had qualities that we can recognize now, like skeuomorphic forms of the objects that these things were meant to replicate. I want to play a little bit. This is a short clip of some of the research that was going on at the Visible Language Workshop at the time.
There are two very important things that the Visible Language Workshop is looking at. One is the way in which graphics, which we define in the broadest sense, can be used to filter, define, qualify, and edit that information. And secondly, what the interface or the relation, that the surface or the access of the person to the machine can be like to promote the most creative and the most generative means of communication.
A major concern at the VLW is determining ways in which one can relate to the computer, much in the same manner as you would to a friend or an assistant.
In the short run, what we've begun to do is study ways in which rules can be modeled to the machine so that that machine will then begin to assume some of the responsibility for work which is repetitive or describable.
We're working on a system which employs a rule base to assist in the process of graphic design and text layout. To do this, we're using an expert system development tool called CAS, and we've chosen the design of business cards to serve as a case study.
In what industry is your profession? Financial, advertising, art, or science?
Advertising.
What position do you hold?
Management.
What is your company's financial scale?
Medium.
What type of image would you like to project?
Progressive.
Please wait while I get creative.
Given the internal rules that we've put into the system, it's decided that this particular layout is appropriate for me based on the answers I gave it.
Okay, so it's funny, yes, but even with some distance, if you can erase the kind of nostalgia and, I mean, just plain humor that's in it, you can see an exploration of the desire of what we want those interfaces to do and how we want them to behave and how we want them to relate to graphic design, even if these are paths kind of not taken. And a lot of this work existed, but it existed in tentative media formats which would fall away quickly, which is a main motivation in kind of collecting this together both into a book and into the exhibition and documenting the work. At the Media Lab, Cooper did not write very often, but she did edit one issue of Design Quarterly out of the Walker Art Center. It was on computers and design, and on the cover, she used a software program to do 9 different versions of the cover, which are reproduced on the cover. They also were exploring what they called it the ultimate designer workstation, and how we might use screens and input devices to do graphic design in an iterative, responsive way. Now, this is an image from the VLW also about the same time. It's a large format Polaroid print, kind of like that other one. But this image started out in CIS, started out digital, and remained digital. It was what I like so much about. There's a great insight that Muriel Cooper had, which I think may be one of her strongest, which early on, this is late 1970s, she said, well, in time, digital images are going to stay on the screen, and they're going to have a life of their own through networks. I mean, it sounds like, of course we know that, right? But at the time, we did not know that. And the way in which she pushed that through and made this image, for example, to kind of stand as a pointer towards that idea. I'm just nearly done. We're going to watch the last thing, which is Muriel Cooper introducing that TED Talk where we started. And we'll let the video that she showed, I'll let that play, and we'll move on.
What the new form and content of design of communication might be. And to that end, for many years, we've been building sort of prototype and visualization tools that would allow us to do something that seemed relatively intuitive, and in order to say, what if we did this, then what would happen, but to really visualize the stuff in as tight and iterative a loop as we possibly could. So we're looking for new design principles, we're not at all sure what they are.
Then she proceeded to show this, this work, which is called The Information Landscapes. And it was a proposal for an immersive typographic environment that the user navigates their way through, that uses relationships, three-dimensional relationships in space to articulate relationships that might be communicated on a two-dimensional surface by bold and Roman or type size or other kind of typographic relationships. And so this, this interface, in a lot of ways, collected her ideas about the user and the reader having some degree of agency in the design and orientation of the materials that they're using. It leveraged off of traditional graphic design knowledge, but then rethought it in a completely new manner. As I described, this work had a large impact when it was shown, and she traveled around showing it elsewhere. This was in 1994, in February 1994. She returned back to Cambridge after a trip to England and died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The work in the meantime, I feel like hasn't been replicated or communicated or dealt with to the degree that I thought it would. And I think it's an open question as to why that's the case. Certainly when she died was must be part of it, but it must be part of a larger story about how it's difficult to file the work under existing categories. That's one thing. What a design practice might look like that's made with other people and that doesn't sit in neatly defined disciplinary boundaries.
Thanks, David. That was great.
Sure. Pleasure.
So I want to just start this off looking at this image because this was my way into Muriel Cooper. I saw the photo before I knew of her or had seen her work and was immediately drawn to it for all of the reasons that you had previously said. She is barefoot. She's surrounded by unidentified men, as you put it. So I wanted to ask you how you came to Muriel's work. What was your way in?
My way into her work was twofold. Originally, when I first started working in graphic design, I was working at IDEO in San Francisco from 1995 to 1997. I was working for a Media Lab student named Gita Solomon, who was head of interaction design there. And I was hired as an interaction designer, and I didn't even quite know what that meant. I was barely a graphic designer at that point. However, at IDEO, there was a hotbed of activity around that emerging field, and a lot of it centered around Muriel Cooper's work, either people who had gone to the Media Lab or people who knew it, etc. So that's when I was originally introduced to it, and then I came back to it when in 2006, I think 2005, 2006, when I was doing graphic design for the MIT Center for Advanced Visual Studies. Mm-hmm. And that was, I went up there and found a closet full of posters that had a inventory, kind of listing of what all the things they had done at the place over the years, and they were exceptional posters, and I thought, oh, these must have been designed by Muriel Cooper. So I knew she was around, and et cetera. And so that piqued my interest, and I started to look into it. Turns out none of them were designed by Muriel Cooper, but she'd printed most of them. Okay. So again, it's kind of like this sideways, and then anyway, that drew me into the work, and that became a fellowship with MIT, and then led to a small original text, and then with Robert Wiesenberger, it turned into an exhibition, and then with Rob as well, the book.
Great.
Long version.
I also wanted to ask you about the book's epigraph, which is a quote from Muriel Cooper that says, "I guess I'm never sure that print is truly linear." And that's a quote that she gave Janet Abrams in that ID story. What's the significance of this quote for you and Robert? Why did you choose to start the book that way?
I'm pretty sure it was Rob who thought of it as the epigraph in the book, and I said, that's fantastic. But why it was appealing was it has the circular quality of the way that she speaks and thinks. And so it's like, she says, she admits to doubt in the statement. You know, it's not like she says books are not truly linear, print is not truly linear. She says I'm not convinced, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's that kind of productive doubt that runs through her work, and it sounds like typical of how she would speak. Seemed like a great way to a lightly perverse way to start a giant hardback monograph.
I like that. I think that right before that quote in that interview too, she was reversing something that she said, right? She said print was linear, and then she goes back and says, I'm never quite sure. So I see
Exactly.
that circle of doubt. So you frame your essay in the book around 7 artifacts, and you zero in on those pieces to tell a particular story about Muriel's work as a whole. I'm wondering if outside of those 7 pieces that you feature in the book, are there any that just didn't make the cut? Any edge cases that we should know about?
There are so there are so many. There's so many that just didn't fit because of space, mm-hmm. and that's it. The work that's in the archive probably is of quite uneven quality. And so sometimes they're picked for the subject matter as much as for the kind of graphic design or whatever interest in them. I'd say we scratched the surface. Her work was exceedingly well documented in terms of collected. It wasn't organized at the time, although Massachusetts College of Art, where the Muriel Cooper archive is, has done incredible work to put it together, and then they were very generous with us, giving us access and pulling things and reproducing things. And
great. And then last question, and then I'll open it up to you guys to ask some questions, and the mics over to the side. Can you talk about the influence that Muriel Cooper's work has had on your own work?
Okay. I think as I was describing in the talk, she was always interested in both doing the work and being aware of doing the work, or kind of interrogating what it is to do the work. And I think that's something that I've borrowed quite a lot from her model, and which is a degree of kind of reflexivity in like doing design and how it gets done. And this is not for the sake of introspection or anything like this, but rather it's to productively kind of question assumptions that exist. And so so that's certainly one way that she's influenced me. And I think the second way, the second kind of direct influence she had is just through imagining interfaces that were completely real time, and that kind of evolved with the point of view of the person using it. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we know well now, but didn't know well even when I started working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great. All right, anybody else have questions for David?
Hi, I just wondered, after her death, what happened to the Visible Language Laboratory, and were there people who could actually continue her work, or did it really stop with her death?
There were people. There were her students. Ron McNeil is still living. That was her partner in the Visible Language Workshop. There were all of her students continued and left and kind of create this diaspora of VLW work. For example, Lisa Strausfeld was there at the time. She's gone on to do lots of things within graphic design proper. There were students who didn't directly study under her, but studied after her in what became the Physical Language Workshop under John Maeda, like Ben Fry, who've gone on to do lots of work. So it continued, but it continued with a kind of sudden hole. So I think that changed things.
I was just looking at the work again and sort of realizing how radical it still looks to today, how unexpected. And I just wanted to know, I mean, often when the future gets here, it arrives in kind of a normal way or an expected way. And what do you think about radical interfaces now? I
wonder if it's partly a factor of her working in an academic context. You know, I think yes, the work does look radical. It didn't look like anything else that existed when it emerged, and I think that is partly to do with her kind of finding a unique line through graphic design, interface design that other people weren't following. I mean, I understand that she would always watch cartoons on Saturday mornings because that kind of animation was interesting to her for her work. Not that it looked like that, but all the techniques of how you abstract out and use graphics to filter information and, you know, play things out dynamically over time. So it's like, you know, she might have said that was a radical interface. I have no idea about radical interfaces now, other than, of course, in a commercial situation, it's more challenging to introduce something that doesn't have a precedent because it relies on all the conventions that exist. So the radical things have to be radical in one way and not radical at all in another way, right?
I'm just curious for your thoughts. Given that so many of the people who came after Muriel Cooper, they are interaction designers, they sometimes self-identify as artists. What do you think is her ultimate legacy? Is there a way to tidily tie that up, given that we're in a room full of UX designers today?
Yeah. I think her presence is most felt within graphic design as it kind of transfers over to interaction design. So I suppose, and so I don't think her legacy is visible at all in art, let's say, even if some of the people who she influenced kind of went on in that or identified in that direction. I think her background and training was graphic design, so that's where the work is kind of legible. So I think probably her legacy exists in lots of graphic designers today, most graphic designers today who are working on screen as the destination. So it's a dispersed legacy. I don't know. It's certainly not easy to identify it concretely. But there are concrete parts to it. Like, for example, the architecture machine group at the beginning of the 1970s, they were developing anti-alias type. So every time we see type on the screen that's blurred in order to make it sharper, that came from there. Or interfaces that use kind of immediate feedback to acknowledge kind of user input, and that gap between when the action happens and its corresponding effect on screen was reduced directly comes from her work. So.
I'm actually curious to know, maybe these are two questions, but they're actually one. I'm curious to know what the graphic design community thought of Muriel Cooper. I mean, graphic design until very recently seems to be still a little bit fearful of computers. I mean, coding isn't even taught in most graphic design programs. I recall reading a little bit of Paul Rand and him being sort of very, very skeptical of what computers could do in the early design process. And I wonder how Muriel communicated the value of computers or new interfaces in the more pure graphic design world. I mean, I'm sure she felt right in at MIT Media Lab, but how about outside of that?
Yeah. You know, I think, she never learned how to program. She tried a bunch of times and kind of it was not something that she wanted to spend enough time to engage with, even though, and she was consistently frustrated apparently by how slow computers were, no matter what newest computer is always like, you know, she was cursing up a storm saying this computer's too slow. So I also understand that she would insist on breaking out conversations of design from technology, which sounds funny and retrograde. But Lisa Strausfeld has mentioned that was an eye-opening distinction for her, because you could talk about the way something worked and felt and what it should do in absence of what it can do or, you know, cannot do. So I think by making that distinction, it helped her have a clearer foothold in the graphic design community. But I also think her work is necessarily messy. It's not like tidy graphic design, and so she was embraced. But I expect there's a good bit of skepticism as well within that community also.
Okay, looks like we're out of time.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.